Hello and welcome back to the CCSE Research Conference, Democracy and the Media. Up next is our session, Enhancing Scholarship and Learning with the C-SPAN Video Library. More experimentation is being done on ways to use the C-SPAN Video Library in the classroom. And this panel looks at two innovative approaches, including using QR codes linked to clips in the video library in a widely used communication textbook, and in the course itself, utilizing audio from the video library to produce educational podcasts on civics literacy. The panel is moderated by Matthew Bergbower, Department Chair and Professor of Political Science at Indiana State University. He teaches and conducts research in the area of American politics. His book, A Profile of the American Electorate, was published by Routledge in 2019 and offers a variety of institutional reforms needed to promote a more informed and active citizenry. Some of his other work can be seen in Social Science Quarterly, Journal of Elections, Public Opinion and Parties, Democracy and Security, C-SPAN Archives book series, and the Journal of Political Science Education. Welcome, Matthew Bergbower.
Yes, hi. Hi, Andrea. Thank you for that introduction. And hello to our panelists and guests. So this is a little bit of a detour from the panels that we've had already today. It's an hour-long session, and it's to present two major projects, both affiliated with Purdue. Both use the C-SPAN archives to produce a major piece of work for either classroom use or a student body use, depending on a book or podcast form. Creative ways to use the archives I found, and I believe that Jen and Lindsey have prepared a presentation on their book, and I've looked at their book and I have some questions for them after their presentation. We can talk about it. And then Connie may have a video to show about the podcast series, and then we're going to have a conversation as well about your work and your office's work on that podcast series. So if you don't mind, I'll turn it over to Jen and Lindsey, and they can talk about the communications book.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and get us started. So we did write a book, which sounds like a huge accomplishment, and it is. And what's really nice about our book is, one, we got to do it with friends and colleagues. And two, it was in response to what we saw as a need. And three, it has a huge reach. And so what I want to do is begin by introducing our book and then preview our session. So the book that we're talking about is called Presentations That Matter. It's a textbook that's used across the country. It's used at smaller institutions that are using it for just a course. It's also used at Purdue University to help teach COM 114 and COM 217, the Science COM course. I'm not at Purdue anymore. You know, it really serves as a common artifact that students can have that reaches across sections. It's that common learning experience. So you're talking, what, Jen, is it still like 3,500 students that take that course per semester? So that's huge. You're talking, what, roughly 7,000 per academic year. At Maryland, we use it for our fundamental of presentational speaking course as well. So you're talking 3,800 to 4,000 students per academic year. So again, this book has a large reach. And what we wanted to do is make sure that it was timely and that it was responsive to both student and instructor needs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of writing the book. And then I'm going to talk about those student and instructor needs before turning it over to Jen, who will talk about how she's used the book and extended it in COM 217, which again is that science writing and communicating course at Purdue. So to begin with, Jen Hall and I both got our PhD from Purdue. However, we never crossed paths in terms of what our academic journey should have been. We weren't in coursework together. We weren't in the same cohort, but we did end up meeting through common friends. And that common friend is Melanie. And Melanie Morgan, who's faculty at Purdue. She taught both of us how to teach COM 114 at Purdue, which is, again, the presentational speaking course. She taught us how to teach in a college setting, and she taught us how to navigate higher ed more generally. So I would say she was definitely, that pedagogical mentor that we really needed as we were going through our coursework and developing as scholars ourselves. So all of our background is in that course, but we all moved on. So Jen is now the course director position. She moved into that role Melanie had. So she is the course director at Purdue for COM 114 and COM 217. Dr. Melanie Morgan's now the associate dean at the graduate school and a full professor in the Brian Lamb School of Communication. And I, after graduating, went to the University of Maryland, where I am the basic course director for COM 107, which is the COM 114 equivalent, and COM 200, which is our critical thinking and speaking course. I am also the associate chair and an associate professor in the department. So our shared background in COM 114 from Purdue, as well as our unique experiences, have led us to recognize a gap in the current presentational speaking texts that were available to our students. And that really underscores the need for this book and really serves as the impetus for us to start writing and working together. We wanted to create a book that had real world examples of why our students were using this book. It's funny, on the first day of class, some of my new instructors never know really how to hit home the need for the class. And through this textbook, it really does that and hits it over and over again throughout the chapters, where we see how people are using presentational skills that we're teaching every single week in real life settings. So interviewing, testifying, briefings, speeches of introduction, group projects where they have to hand over the presentation to the next person. We also recognized that we needed to incorporate technology. Now, we started writing this book before COVID, and we have multiple editions out. But technology was one thing that we recognized we had to not fight in the classroom, but incorporate in a meaningful way. So we found that this technology is accessible. Students can use it on their phones, any devices they use. Instructors can pull it up easily enough. And what we do is we use QR codes in the hard copy, and we have embedded links in the ebook. And like I said, it's on demand, which is so nice, especially after the opening session that we had this morning, where we talked about the different ways people are consuming media, that they don't wait for live sessions anymore, that they do expect this immediacy of being able to get the technology, get the messaging that they want. The other thing we saw is that students didn't want just good stock examples of presentational speaking. They wanted to see everyday speakers, that person coming up to the podium to be able to speak about a topic they're passionate about, as opposed to a student who is in some sort of hypothetical situation presenting for a camera. It also needed to represent a variety of speakers, so students can see themselves in the examples, not always the archetype of the white man speaking well. And so we were very intentional about finding voices that represent a variety of our students. And we also thought about that in terms of ideological representation, so making sure that we had examples that pulled from a gamut of political representation. So it's not just liberal, not just conservative. And in terms of instructors, we recognize that this was a little bit of a shift in the way that they've been teaching the course if they were to adopt this textbook. And so there would also be various experiences in the classroom. At Purdue and the University of Maryland, I know that some of the instructors come in and they've just finished undergrad. And that's tough. And so having the limited experience and then creating a textbook that has all these vetted examples that are available on demand that demonstrate certain concepts is incredibly helpful. It's also helpful for that seasoned instructor that gets asked to teach the course, or that maybe has some outdated examples. It's already built in. And we can easily update the examples that we use. And I'm going to show some examples in a second. Well, screenshots of examples. I'm not going to show the videos for you all. But it can easily be updated based on instructor and student needs. So at our institutions, we do really keep an open line of communication with our instructors. I think Jen does it more informally by if any instructor sees something that they want changed or revised, they can come in, make suggestions, she notes them, and it really does help inform our revision process. And again, we work very collaboratively in the process. At the end of every one of my semesters, I administer a anonymous survey that our instructors can fill out and talk about what they liked and what they didn't like. And again, that informs us so that we're really making sure that this book is informed by the student and instructor experience. Before talking about using the book, I want to stop and ask if there are any questions about the beginning, which was just how we all work together and the impetus for the book.
Actually, I had a quick question. So you said that Dr. Hall's course was for science writing. So was this something that when you guys put this book together, you were specifically trying to address?
I can jump in. Sorry, Lindsay.
No, go for it, please.
So when we were writing the book, one of the things we thought about was that we have our basic course, but I think Maryland, as well as Purdue being Big Ten, we're very STEM heavy universities, and we get a lot of STEM students. So we were always thinking about how do we sort of hit those different majors while still, doing, lots of political science, but really looking for examples of people working in those more STEM technical fields. And making sure that what we were including was going to speak to students kind of no matter what major they were in.
Thank you.
Somewhat related, you did mention the content and the clips that you sought out wanted to definitely be relevant to the students that you were teaching. And I noticed that the clips that you did pick out were some of the most most recent clips, right, of C-SPAN. You didn't want to dig into the 1980s and the 1990s as good examples for persuasion theories or information literacy. Is that correct as an approach?
Yeah, and so some of our examples, which you should all be able to see my PowerPoint now, which just includes some screenshots from the book. Some of the examples you'll see were from 2010. We have a Stephen Colbert example there. And the timeliness is not important in that example, right? We have someone who is speaking about immigration. And while immigration has definitely changed over the last 10 years, the principles that we're trying to demonstrate in that clip have not changed. However, we do have more recent things that came through. We do, since it's science heavy institutions, we do have like a lot of NASA clips, and a lot has happened with NASA over the last several years. And the other example I have on here, we talk about civility in the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, and that was fairly recently. So yeah, we're not drawing back to the 80s, but we do have stuff that is very recent and stuff that is a little older.
Can I jump in too? I think another thing that we really talked about when we were putting this together is we can find clips on C-SPAN of really great orators. And the idea, though, is most of our students are not going to go in that direction. And so part of it was, let's try to find people they can relate to and they can see themselves in. So that I often tell my students on the first day of class, you don't have to be the next John F. Kennedy. You don't have to be the next Barack Obama. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from those, but at the same time, we wanted to focus more on these, I guess, more tangible examples for the students.
It's the everyday examples.
Yes, that helps a lot, because I definitely noticed that theme in the sample chapters that I was looking at. A student from North Mexico who talked about concussions during a congressional committee hearing, a school teacher that gave a speech at a convention, I think. So there was a lot of examples that kind of surprised me. I was expecting 4 speeches from the House and Senate, but your logic is much better than my logic.
Well, and let me just tell you, that is one of the things that, as sort of a newbie to the archives when we started this project, was how much content exists on C-SPAN that is not congressional hearings, that are not floor speeches, that are conferences or interviews. And so that was another thing. I was talking to someone in my family and they were like, oh, so is your lean really political in your book? And because I said C-SPAN. And I said, no, it's kind of fascinating, the wide array of things you can find in there. So I learned a lot.
Well, now we're going to move on to how our book looks and how it's actually used in the classroom. I'm going to give a quick overview and then I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who, like I said, is going to discuss an extension of how she uses the book in her course. So this is the table of contents. It's the opening page for the ebook. What was really nice is that we had planned to launch the ebook before COVID hit. And so when it did hit and moved college instruction, all instruction online, it really was seamless. It was integrated into the learning management system at Purdue. At Maryland, it nicely complemented what we were doing through Zoom courses and our learning management system as well. And as you can see, students are able to determine what content is going to be covered in this course. And they're able to easily go through the chapters, click on them. Each chapter follows the same format. We have chapter 1 here, which lists out the objectives. At the beginning of each chapter, we have a featured C-SPAN example. So as I mentioned for chapter 1, we have Stephen Colbert, and this is from 2010, where he's talking about immigration and citizenship reform. Each chapter also has the series of discussion questions. And this is, again, helpful. Imagine yourself as a new instructor or as a student who's watching this. These questions help guide your attention to specific components of the presentation so that it's not just, what do you think of Stephen Colbert, but it's something very specific. After reading this chapter, you should be able to identify the strategies he used when addressing the Judiciary Subcommittee. And then this is what the video looks like. So as I said, it's embedded in the ebook where students could just hit the play button and they could keep those questions in mind as the class started. And this is a nice way also for lesson planning where instructors are able to just use this to start the class, right? To start the class discussion, move on to activities, hone in on certain content, but you're starting with that visual, which is incredibly useful when we're trying to talk to students about the practicality of this course and this content in their personal, professional, civic, and academic lives. That's not the only place where we have these examples. Throughout the chapters, when we get to a specific content area, we include other C-SPAN clips. And so this one here is where we're talking about ethics and civility. And we're using the Kavanaugh hearing for an example of what not to do, where it was an exchange between two senators that didn't have the climate that we're hoping students in our classes and our sections and higher ed in general would demonstrate when they're listening to their colleagues and classmates present. So that is what the book looks like.
And also we do, sorry, Lindsay, I just want to
No,
jump
please.
in. We
I love
initially did
conversation.
not have an ebook. We have a hard copy and we do still sell those. And so how we initially did it was that we put QR codes for all of the clips. So as a student was reading, they could just pull out their phone and watch them. So we've tried to make it accessible in a lot of different ways.
The last thing I want to add is Jen, Melanie, and I work very closely together. So when we ever come across a topic or a C-SPAN clip that we think would work well for the book, we do email each other the link. So this is a constant process of thinking about the textbook, thinking about what our students and instructors need, and making sure that we're producing a high quality book that meets those needs. With that, we do have rollover of the clips, and we have created an appendix that captures some of the clips that have been used in previous editions. So instructors are also not limited, and students are not limited to just what's in the current edition of the text, but they can go back and see what we used for special occasion presentations in previous versions and see the examples there. So they really are getting more clips than just what's in the handful of chapters that we have. So with that, Jen, do you want to talk about how you've extended and built on this book?
All right. Thank you, Lindsay. So Lindsay did a great job of kind of covering what we were doing. And so I'm going to talk about this semester, I'm teaching COM 217, which is our science communication course. And this summer, I had the opportunity to participate in a workshop about CURES, is the acronym, and I looked this up to make sure I got it right. It is course-based undergraduate research experiences. So all of the literature shows that undergraduate research is a high impact practice. and has tons of benefits to student learning. And I mentioned this in the last panel. After last year, I judged for the CCSE undergraduate research competition. And I started to see, okay, I'm teaching a class about communication techniques. Here are undergraduate students looking at those. How can I bring it all together? And what I thought about too, in my own personal interest, is one of the things that our book really focuses on is explaining complex information. So even if it's not science, all of our students are becoming experts in something, and how do they convey that to a lay audience? And I've always kind of wondered, we do these things and they take an undergraduate course, but are they really going out into the world and using these? And so I thought about, one thing again that I think students don't necessarily realize is that scientists, academics are called before Congress to testify. And that can have huge implications for a variety of things. So I was kind of curious, what kind of techniques are our science community using? Are they being effective? And so this kind of developed into a semester-long project my students are doing. So the primary goals I had for the project was, one, I wanted to expose them to this concept of that they have their science, but their ability to communicate it is essential. And so I wanted to also just increase their personal value of their communication skills and development. I also wanted them to start to see that connection between science and research and the world that we live in. So the idea that it matters what NASA is doing, but also too, it matters what people are saying about it, because that's going to change budgets, all of those kind of things. And then two, I wanted them to see what it looks like when someone does a really great job and what it looks like when someone does not do a great job. And so this is the pilot semester, so I'm learning as we go. But and the other thing to know is this course is, because it's 200 level, it's primarily sophomores and juniors. I have a few freshmen, so they're a little further along from a variety of science disciplines, everything from actuarial science to biology. So I put them into teams and gave them a general topic. And what they had to do over the course of the semester is they found within a 2-year period, actually congressional hearings where experts were testifying. And then in groups, sort of using a grounded theory approach, analyzing what those experts were seeing and what techniques they were using. So we kicked off the semester with a visit from Andrea and Connie to kind of just expose students to the archive, show them how to search, see what they could do. And then from there, I have some milestones, and I've been having them complete reflections every 2 weeks so I can kind of see what they're thinking about. And it's been really, really interesting how quickly they have caught on to what matters. And so often in the reflection, like we'll look at a thing in class and they're constantly comparing and contrasting, like, well, that one did like a really good job. Like, did you see that? He sounded like he was just like talking to us. And that one sounded like that. And then getting them to go deeper, like, are they using analogies? And the goal of this project too, is I would like to continue it throughout this as additional semesters. So I feel like this semester, my students are really laying the groundwork for kind of what things are we seeing, and we'll move on. Another component of this that I think has been really beneficial to the students is I'm requiring, now they are an honors class too. I guess I should have mentioned that, but I think any student could do this, but they are required to engage in an additional scholarly endeavor. So they have to either enter the CCSE undergraduate research competition, they have to enter the Purdue Fall Research Expo, or they have to write something up for our undergraduate research journal. And so again, getting them used to this idea of, okay, now that you've conducted research, how do you talk about it? And who is your audience for that? And so even just little things in class, the other day, someone was like, well, can you explain the difference between the two conferences and what the goals are? And I was like, okay, you're getting it. Like, this is why we're doing this. So, and again, students have been really surprised. I know Connie brought in like just some funny clips and just kind of talking about what people are doing. And so, yeah, I think it's been a really great way to make what often I feel like is sometimes abstract. And it's hard for me to find an example. Like, I don't have footage of a staff meeting, right? That people are pitching this and who are like nuclear engineers, but I do have footage of those people talking about that. I did intentionally, just because we're still in the thick of it, not do COVID, because believe me, there's like tons of fascinating stuff out there. So for now, and so my topics were kind of based on student interest: opioid crisis, space regulation, cryptocurrency, and I'm totally blanking on the other one, but it was something very interesting. So, yeah. So does anyone have any questions or, and the other thing, I just want to give a shout out to the CCSE for being so supportive of this project. Training, they actually moved the date for the undergraduate competition for me so that my students would have enough time to get far enough along in their project. So, that has been so great. And it was so evident when they were meeting with my students, like that, you know, they were a resource for my students too. So just want to say thank you publicly to both of you.
Actually, Jen, I do have a question.
Yeah.
So as you're talking with your students about these different pathways that they can go through with the research, how are you getting them to kind of wrap their brain around how to use the C-SPAN video library with these concepts?
Right. Well, and I think the nature of it, the project has been really great. So, you know, and that was at first, like, but so one of the things I was like, okay, use your searching and then find here and start to watch it and see. And, you know, so I think one of the good things is they had those parameters. And then within that, and the other thing that was interesting is we were talking about kind of analyzing it and finding it, the different groups have come up with different strategies. So some are like, we're going to divide and conquer. And another group was like, we're each going to watch this person, but he's going to watch for analogies and he's going to watch for delivery. And then too, it was interesting, like when I was talking to a student about the CCSE and she was like, oh, so like, we're analyzing like 10 things. We're just going to pick one and talk about it for that. Right. And I was like, yes, exactly. Like that's what we're doing. So it has been, and again, they're so tech savvy. I've been really impressed by how easily they've been able to find and access stuff. And they had to do kind of initial, they just finished their code books and so far so good.
Thank you, Jen.
You're welcome. Yes.
Oh, sure, Robert, go for it.
When you say you find clips, you and Lindsey and Melanie, do you find them by searching the video library or do you find them by watching something that you see on C-SPAN?
I do both, actually. I will, sometimes I get inspiration from like my daily life and I'm like, I wonder if C-SPAN has something on fill in the blank, and then I'll go in and search it. Or I'll go to like the homepage, especially where you have like the education, even some of the K through 12 education. And I'll go in there and see what sort of resources are available and see where I guess I'm inspired to pull something. But mine is very open. I like to go in, watch clips and see if it exemplifies something and then pull forward. And that's why we have such good communications, because sometimes I'll find something awesome and I'll be like, this is a great example of persuasion, but I'm not in charge of revising the persuasive unit. So I'll send it to Jen and be like, check this out. What do you think? And so I think having that relationship and the familiarity with the C-SPAN archives is just so incredible. And again, Connie and her team and Andrea and her team have been so helpful in terms of how to actually get the clips into the book.
And I would say, yeah, it's a really open process, I think. And that's one of the things I was talking with my students about. I was like, this search engine, it's not Google. Like, it's not necessarily a smart search, right? So I feel like you have to be more specific. The other thing I found really helpful, maybe I shouldn't disclose this, is other people who clip things often label them in ways that's very helpful. So I've been able to see like other people have pulled things and like called it visual aid. And I'm like, okay, let's go see what they have. And the other thing I was going to tell, piggybacking on what Lindsey said, for this latest edition, I was on the phone with Melanie and I'm like, oh my gosh, I just found the coolest clip. And it was about the missing Indigenous women. And Melanie's like, too late. I already claimed it. So we had both found the same clip for totally different chapters. So she won that one. So
We do that. I took one of Melanie's too.
that's what we do.
I will like search people too. And I think that's incredibly useful too. So if there's someone whose speaking style you really like, or whose like message or platform is really important, searching people.
Go for it, Connie. Yes.
Well, I guess my question to you is, how did you decide on the use of the QR code versus whether there are other technologies? But that is something pretty specific. You know, it was hot for a while, and then it just kind of like, it wasn't hot. Nobody wanted to use them for a long time. And now they're kind of making a resurgence, as I understand it. Was there a technological reason why the QR code was your go-to?
I'm trying to remember. I honestly think what it is Melanie Morgan, our third author. Her husband, Dr. Bart Collins, is also a professor in the department, and he's like techno geek. Like he loves things. I think it was his idea.
I think it's pretty brilliant. I don't remember like the exact reason, but I do think there's some elements of accessibility to it too. And like if students are using their phones and we're trying to embrace technology as opposed to fight it, then being able to have students use this on their smartphone or on their tablets in a way that is very easy worked well. And I agree with Connie, like they're coming back. I watch the Today Show every single morning and they have the QR codes in the corner that they're always constantly pointing to. And so I think it was a good decision, and I think it makes sense for the student needs.
Yeah. And one of the things, initially we were like, we could put like a little URL, but we were like, what is the likelihood that a student's going to be reading their hard copy book and go type it in? So integrating it. And then when we've been able to go to these digital platforms, like it's literally on the page for them, like click play and watch it. And I know here at Purdue, we have online quizzes and I always include questions just to get them watching them, which has been another thing I think that was really helpful for my students. And I'm actually just now putting this together. They were using the textbook. So they are seeing C-SPAN clips as they're doing their readings and we're talking about them. And then additionally, it's like, okay, see what we have here in the book. Now let's see what you can do. So I think that's been a real benefit.
I got one more quick question.
Go for it, Robert.
How do you avoid, when you talk about bad speeches, how do you avoid something that's truly embarrassing? I mean, I know a couple of cases that I could tell you where the students might feel very sorry for the person giving the speech because it's so bad. Did you like have a cutoff where it was just like deliberately, it was just flat kind of speech as opposed to something that's truly embarrassing?
I would say we don't have a ton of examples of bad speaking. We do, but one of the things I did, I know like I wrote the delivery chapter. I did choose Congress people because I feel like that's their job. And so I feel better critiquing them than like somebody like a private citizen who's speaking at a rally, more power to them. So I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that was kind of one of the things was like, I feel like if you are working for the United States government and you're like an elected official, we can critique you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's incivility and what not to do in communication. And
Yes.
that's where members of Congress can come in and be helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I understood. Connie, do you have we're going to show the video, right?
Sure.
And do you want to set it up in any way?
Yeah,
Okay.
I do, because I think it'll be helpful. So we all know that kids are crazy about podcasts these days. Students are. And the idea for this whole project came actually from President Mitch Daniels. He didn't send it to us. He was trying to talk about the idea of civics literacy and a project at Purdue. we kind of thought about it for a while and said, we're the perfect place at CCSE to provide something that could be used within the civics literacy vein. And so we jumped on the idea of podcast and knew that we could use the C-SPAN archives to make those podcasts. So we brought in a visiting scholar to actually write them because we wanted them to be very academically rigorous. And we also just talked about the different ways in which we can make them very student oriented. And by that, I mean, how do you teach, the beginnings of the government and history to a group of students in a podcast when your competition is podcasts out there that are giving them all the stuff that they want to listen to, right? Which may not be history. And so the decision was the storytelling. The decision was to approach it by telling stories, which is what many podcasts do. And what we thought by turning this, instead of a history lesson, into a storytelling session that included then the clips and then the history and ended again with more of the story, was a way to bring the students in. So Andrea's going to play the video, but the video is not geared toward you as professors. It is geared toward the students. So this is the way in which we're trying to tell the students, this might be something that you would be interested in. So Andrea, can you play it?
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Who counted among we the people when our Constitution was new? Well, not very many people.
It is the voice of a group of people who've surveyed their circumstances, diagnosed them, and decided to change their lives.
Among the delegates were dandies in silk suits and men who looked like the Puritans of old. There were flagrant womanizers, confirmed bachelors, and one newlywed in his 50s.
The greatest, the most lyrical, the author of the most famous words in American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And also the most racist.
This is My Constitution, a podcast from the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement at Purdue University. In this episode, we'll discuss freedom of religion. In this episode, we'll discuss the freedom of speech. In this podcast, we'll discuss the powers of the presidency. In this episode, we'll discuss the work of the United States Supreme Court.
Have you ever changed your mind because of an oral argument?
Yes, I would say, but very rarely.
I usually have to write 2 or 3 drafts pretty much from scratch before I'm reasonably satisfied.
Most people think they have a right to come to the court. For the most part, you don't.
These podcasts are about 20 minutes each, so they're convenient, they're easy, and they're quick to watch whenever you'd like. They're basically just snapshots into American history, our founding, how it affects today's society and politics.
It's a breakdown of the history behind these amendments, what has guided them, the legislative arguments that have been used in order to get to certain Supreme Court decisions, and how what impact and legacy these leave on our current status in America.
In 3, 2, 1. This is My Constitution, a podcast from the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement at Purdue University.
They really try and use storytelling so you can picture it inside your head, because this is just audio. These podcasts really bring in storytelling through a narrative series. You have the overview of the narrator, but then you have excerpts from outside sources, interviews with first-hand sources, professors from all over the country.
He said, please tell my friends in South Carolina that if a single drop of blood is shed against the United States, I will hang the first person I find from the highest tree.
They really try and use storytelling so you can picture it inside your head.
We will marry free today.
It rendered the voters of tens of millions of Americans who
have gone to the ballot box and said that marriage should be between a man and a woman, as it has been for countless millennia.
We'll marry free
Storytelling in podcasts is really a really helpful tool for me to kind of process information a lot better.
When Willie woke that morning, he knew he was going to die. The state's mobile electric chair, commonly known as Gruesome Gertie, was waiting for him.
And they walked Willie over to the electric chair and they strapped him in. The executioner said, "Goodbye, Willie," which is what they said right before they flipped the switch, and then he flipped the switch. Immediately, Willie began to shake in the chair. He started going into convulsions.
Because they take this information, but they weave this wonderful narrative storytelling into it. Where you're learning the history, you're learning the key players. The one that really surprised me, or I guess maybe it's a soundbite that really surprised me, was in the case about the First Amendment and freedom of speech. It cuts to this story about the burning of crosses by KKK members or otherwise white supremacists onto the lawns of black families.
Now, it's my understanding that we had almost 100 years of lynching and activity in the South by the Knights of Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan. And this was a reign of terror, and the cross was a symbol of that reign of terror. Isn't that significantly greater than intimidation or a threat?
Well, I think they're coextensive, Justice Thomas, because it is...
No, my fear is, Mr. Dreeben, that you're actually understating the symbolism of an effect of the cross.
Understanding these rationale of American framework of why the rules are the way they are, why current events happen the way they do, and why legislation is the way that it is. No matter what you study and what area of life you're in, these current events and these legal frameworks are going to surround you wherever you go.
I think my favorite excerpt is from Thomas Jefferson that wrote a lot of the Declaration of Independence, and it's called his document.
About 35% of what he wrote was taken out. He later said it was mutilated. And he was very upset by it. In fact, for 9 years, he refused to admit that he was the principal author of it because he thought that the draft that had come out of the Congress was worse than his. And in fact, like many, maybe I would have done it, maybe some of you would have done it, he later wrote to his friends and said, "By the way, don't you think this Congress did a terrible job?"
So my favorite part about these podcasts is that they're such a convenient form of listening. So as Purdue students, we're always multitasking, trying to get as much done as we can. And so with these podcasts, you can listen on your way to class, in between class, at the gym, while you're doing homework. That's what's really great about them, is that they're convenient. So everyone that comes to Purdue really wants to make a difference in the world. We're producing impactful people every day. And everything in the Constitution and what our founding fathers wrote really impacts every major, every degree, every field that you're going to go into. And I would say that that's why these podcasts really matter. So when you go into the world as a voting and impactful member of society, you know what you're talking about when you talk about the Constitution, when you talk about our government, when you talk about politics. Our government will never change, our government system. The separation of powers, checks and balances, those kind of things will always be important. So knowing why those matter is really important going forward as a professional.
My name is Amanda Shai. I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I'm a rising senior here at Purdue.
My name is McKenna Fitzgerald. I'm a senior here at Purdue, and I'm studying political science and PR and strategic communication.
And there's that QR code again. Yay, go QR codes.
Yes, that was a nicely produced video. And I watched that first before I listened to a couple of podcasts, Connie, that I enjoyed. I listened to the one about the death penalty, and I listened to one about the voting rights. And I'm finally trying to find a way to share it with my own students.
But it's an interesting, you say new, but come on. I mean, I was in radio in the 1970s, and this is basically a long radio show. When you would do 15 that's what I think podcasts are. They're just branded differently. So the ability to kind of just find these little nuggets in the C-SPAN video library, but just use the audio, and then take it into stories. I'll tell you one of the interesting things about working on this project, and Robert, you can chime in on this too, because you were such a part of it, is balancing that rigorous academic review and writing with the type of language and presentation and music and clips that you want to engage the students. And so constantly we kind of were going back and forth, and because of I don't have an academic background, but mine is journalism and radio and television. And so, I would say, well, could we say it this way, and Robert and the writers would say, yeah, but maybe, but what about this word? What about this word? And it was a good experience, as frustrating as it was sometimes, to be able to kind of use that tug and pull of academic rigor, and also just what young people, how to pull them into a learning experience, which is what we're hoping this is.
Yes, and this is part of a university mandate, right? This is one route for Purdue students to take to pass a civic literacy initiative on there?
That's correct. And Robert, you jump in on this because you're part of the committee that's putting together the whole civics literacy. So you were at it at a much higher level before we got it, about what the students are going to need to do.
Yeah, there are 3 routes plus an exam. So they can either take a course, American government usually, or history, or pass the AP tests before they come here, or they could listen to the podcast, or the third one, which is still being developed somewhat, is they can attend so many events, and they have to have that are public affairs events, like Condoleezza Rice spoke on campus, and they could go that route. So, and then they have to take an exam that we had an outside consultant develop. So
this is the idea of a podcast, using podcasts in classrooms is starting to kick in. In fact, the visiting scholar who we used now mandates podcasts in his classrooms. Brian and I did a class on presidential communication a couple of years ago, and the final project was a podcast using C-SPAN audio. Katie's on right now. Katie's does a history class in which she had her students do a series of podcasts. Katie, how did that go for you?
It went great. And actually, that was the one thing that I loved about CCSE, is that you were able to provide some examples of effective podcasts, but also some production tips. I think that what students sometimes get worried about is they get, at least history students, they get hung up on, well, I write papers, I don't do this, I don't have the technical skills. And I think, Connie created a couple of really great presentations that taught them how to do the actual editing. And so I think that the C-SPAN archives have now made it so easy to download clips and everything like that really helps.
You can make podcasts on your phone now. If it once the students kind of get into it. And if you want to do something of a little higher level, you can get a very good podcast set, including the microphones and like 4 inputs, for about $400 these days. So if your department wanted to do that, and I think the CCSE is going to buy one so it would be available for students to come in and use when they wanted to, or God forbid, what was being discussed as the possibility of a university-wide podcast competition here at Purdue, sponsored by the CCSE next semester. Andrea will have her hands full on something like that, because I think the students are going to go crazy. I think they'll love it. And I think it will expose these students to the C-SPAN archives in in kind of an unusual way, kind of like the book does, that Jen and Lindsey and Melanie's book does, because it pulls them in by helping them understand it from their level, by using people that they can identify with, or that they kind of look up to, and using the technology that allows them to just do something a little bit different and creative in their classroom. At least that's my hope.
Well, Matt, how do you, now that you listen to a couple of them, do you see them useful in a classroom?
Yes, very much so. I actually wanted them to be longer, so we could double them. They're about 20 minutes each, and I found myself wanting more. So the death penalty was an interesting one to even pick, let alone listen to. I live in Terre Haute, and Terre Haute has a federal maximum prison, and it's the only federal prison where inmates are put to death. And Donald Trump used that around 8 times during his presidency when it wasn't used since Timothy McVeigh. Now, the death penalty case that you have is in a state issue, and it's the state of Louisiana implementing the death penalty with Willie Francis. And despite the fact that Trump used the death penalty around 8 times, it wasn't a campaign issue. Right? Of the 3 debates, it wasn't asked about once. For white supremacy, I can see that as being a podcast, and that made its way in the national conversation during the Trump years. The fight for suffrage, seen in the video, Susan B. Anthony. So that's a relevant case because voting rights are again being talked about in modern politics. But the death penalty, I was curious to pick your brain on how that made its way to the list. And the implications is actually judicial review. The lesson that you hope to come across is judicial review, but the story is a death penalty story, and that's really what grips the audience.
That was the very first podcast that was produced and written. It was the launching pen, and we were trying to combine, the issue, a story, and our academic was really sure that the Willie Francis story was the story that he wanted to tell. And the more I learned about it, I totally agreed that it was, it was a fascinating story to tell, and that one that students could kind of wrap their hands around. But so on it. Then on the other hand, these are difficult when you choose the story and then you go in and look for the clips, because there is not there, these are in history. And so these clips don't exist of the real people for the most part. The Freedom to Marry one, we were there that day on this, C-SPAN was there that day with its cameras on the Supreme Court steps, recording the people singing the songs and the woman saying marriage is between a man and a woman. Those are great. But when you get to a Willie Francis, you have to really rely on your historians, and then a lot through book TV, a lot of authors that have written books about it. So, how was it chosen? It was chosen just because we thought it was a good story combined with a good way to talk about the death penalty. And in these, we want to make sure that for the students' sake and for everybody's sake, there is a sense of, I will not use the word balance because it gets me into trouble every time I use it, but that there's not a sense of political leaning in this, that we're not screaming against the death penalty, and which is the reason why you heard both sides of that on that day. And that was the same with other issues too. We wanted to make sure that we didn't want to sit there and say, oh, if we talk this issue, we got to talk this issue, but that the overall feel did not come off either to the left or to the right. So.
Yeah, that's right. And I think if there was a balance, not to use, or an inclusion, it was all the aspects of American government.
Yes.
We wanted something on the presidency, whatever.
Right.
And I would also give Peter Watkins, who's our
Yes.
visiting scholar, a lot of credit. He was a long-term teacher, is a long-term teacher. And I think in teaching constitutional law, some of you might know that you come up with gripping stories of the case sometimes to get people interested in the concepts. And so I think he was familiar with some of these stories of on the death penalty. Well, that gets your attention. And I think they came out of some of his classroom experiences too.
I think you're right. And he actually came up with the great titles for some of these too.
Yes.
Andrew, can you put up the web page? Because I think this is a kind of an important component of what we did, is that we added a web page to these that gives a lot more than just the podcasts themselves. So if you could just scroll down, you'll see the podcast here. And let's just click on to the middle one, the one-legged man and the ancient sage. I think you have to be in the box. There you go. So what we did here is you download the podcast here, but if you go across here, you can see that not only did we do a text of the of each podcast, but we also had put a set of goals out there. We put out a set of questions that students or anybody who's watching can think about. We put then the Supreme Court cases that were looked at. That one, yeah. Thank you. Whatever the court case was that was looked at that time and where they can find it, and specifically, if they can listen to it, and then just additional materials that we showed before. So it does give away, going back to the transcript a little bit, one of the things I like about that, if you scan down a little bit more, is that you can click on and it goes to that part of the podcast. So there is a way to actually make this even more useful, I think, in the classroom that way. And I think it's a great addition to just the podcasts themselves.
Yes, if someone has a question, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get you going. Was there an item on the chopping block, Connie, the one that didn't make it to the series that you had to cut off?
Well, this isn't quite the answer to your question, but it's the one thing that jumps out at me the most. And that is that we knew we needed to have one about the Supreme Court. And so, the question is what it was going to be about. What angle do you look at the Supreme Court? And Peter, Dr. Watkins, was looking at what he was going to put into it. Well, I covered the court in the 1980s for C-SPAN. And so in my head, were all these clips. And so I asked him, can you let me write this one? Because I need to get this out of my system, right? And then there was also the question of how do you get students interested in how the Supreme Court works? So we kind of took an angle on it, and we took the angle of C-SPAN's long time work toward getting the Supreme Court covered by television and covered in video, thinking that might be an angle that students, oh, video, oh, you mean you can't watch it? Oh, why can't you watch it? So we kind of weaved that in and showed them clips, or had them listen to clips of Brian Lamb talking about why video of the Supreme Court is important, as well as justices talking about, over my dead body, this will happen. And so it really wasn't a chopping block thing, but it was one where we went all over the place and kind of came back to a central use of just a fun way to talk about how the Supreme Court works, but in a different angle.
So if I listen to the Supreme Court podcast, I'll be listening to Connie's swan song. right?
No, well, I don't know about that, but it was a trip down memory lane. I will tell you. C-SPAN did. I didn't produce it. Mark Farkas produced a documentary on the Supreme Court where all the justices were interviewed. So the archives is very rich with real people talking about, as you saw in the video, Justice Thomas saying, it doesn't work this way, folks. We have Justice Rehnquist in one of the podcast talking. Obviously, Justice Scalia was in some of them. So the ability to actually put the current justices in there was nice, or recent justices.
Andrea, should I turn it over to you? 4:45.
Well, if we have some discussion going on here, we can keep going for a few more minutes. Personally, I wanted to find out from any of the professors that are here, how would you take these materials and integrate them into your courses? I'm very interested in seeing and hearing about that. I know, Matt, you had said that you had taken the podcasts and had already been using them in your coursework.
I've done 2 podcasts in separate ways. Once the Washington posted a presidential series and podcast, and so they profile a president. They try to do it in a creative way, not necessarily an encyclopedic way. And I've done a project like that for students who are assigned a president and have to report back to me some of the initiatives, some of the major policies done during the presidency. And then I've also done Malcolm Gladwell's podcast in a class. I tried to find one that was politically related. He did Brown versus Board of Education. And I simply did a slideshow to the podcast. So pictures of Lyndon Brown, I don't know, a map of Kansas, right? Just keep on going along with the story. And I just did a slideshow to correspond with it. And that was good. And I could probably do a slideshow for the Purdue podcast, thinking about the 2 that I listened to. I could probably do a slideshow corresponding with the podcast and be a great teaching tool. Yeah.